The dust devils danced across the parched earth, mimicking the turmoil in Martha's stomach. 3 small faces, mirroring her own wide-eyed fear, clung to her skirts, each one a tiny echo of Caleb, taken too soon by the fever. Now, the vultures were circling. The auctioneer, a slick-haired man with a voice like oiled gravel, cleared his throat. "Now, gentlemen, we have here a valuable asset, a strong woman, capable of hard work, and 3 bonus hands, ready to earn their keep." He gestured towards Martha and the triplets, Jeb, Eli, and little Ruth. Their eyes, the same deep blue as Caleb's had been, darted nervously between the crowd and the gallows looming at the edge of town. Caleb's debt. A gambling debt, a foolish hand played in a saloon that reeked of whiskey and despair. A debt that now rested squarely on Martha's shoulders and the shoulders of her children. Judge Harding, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with disappointment, had ruled against her. Her land, her meager possessions, and now herself and her devices. A gruff voice boomed from the crowd. $50. It was Silas the blacksmith, a widower with calloused hands and a heart rumored to be just as hard. Martha shuddered. She'd rather face the desert alone than be beholden to him. Another bid followed, then another. The numbers climbed, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of her hope. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing Caleb's weathered face, his calloused hand holding hers. He'd promised to protect them. Now she was alone, facing a future she couldn't bear to imagine. A figure detached itself from the edge of the crowd, a lone rider silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. He moved with a quiet grace, the kind born from years spent in the saddle. Jericho. He rarely spoke, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He owned a small ranch on the outskirts of town, a place carved out of the unforgiving landscape with sweat and grit. Martha had seen him around, a silent observer, his presence a constant, unwavering force. He stopped a few feet from the auctioneer, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, settling finally on Martha and the children. His face was impassive, unreadable. He was a man carved from the same stone as the mountains that surrounded them, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He stood there, a silent sentinel, and the air crackled with unspoken tension. The auctioneer, momentarily flustered, stammered, "Can I help you, Jericho?" Jericho simply raised a hand, a gesture so subtle it was almost missed. But in that gesture, Martha saw something flicker in his eyes, a spark of something else, something that offered a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. The bidding stopped. The only sound was the mournful creak of the hanging tree in the distance. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the midday heat. Jericho finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that barely carried above the desert wind. "Enough." One word, but it landed like a stone, silencing the murmurs, halting the auctioneer mid-sentence. He didn't look at Martha, didn't offer a comforting word or a reassuring glance. He simply turned to Judge Harding, his eyes, cold as river ice, pouring into the man. "The debt is paid." Harding sputtered, his face reddening. "Paid? By whom? And with what?" Jericho reached into his worn leather vest, pulling out a roll of bills. He peeled off enough to cover Caleb's debt, and then some, laying the money on the auctioneer's table. The man's eyes widened as he counted it, his greed momentarily outweighing his surprise. "Consider it a donation," Jericho said, his voice devoid of warmth. He turned back to Martha, his gaze lingering for a moment on the children, before he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the swirling dust devils as quickly as he'd arrived. Martha stood frozen, the weight of disbelief pressing down on her. She was free. They were free. But the freedom felt tainted, bought with a stranger's money, a debt of a different kind now hanging over her head. She watched Jericho disappear, a lone figure swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. That night, a storm rolled in, mirroring the tempest in Martha's heart. She huddled with the triplets in their small cabin, the wind howling like a banshee, rattling the windows. Sleep offered no escape, only a swirling vortex of fear and gratitude. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. Martha knew she couldn't stay. Not here, haunted by Caleb's ghost and the shadow of Jericho's generosity. She packed what little they had, the faces of her children etched with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. They set out towards the west, towards the setting sun, seeking a new beginning, a place where they could outrun the past. As they rode, Martha saw a faint trace leading away from the main road, a trail that led towards Jericho's ranch. She hesitated, her hand tightening on the reins. She knew she should thank him. But what could she say to a man who had saved them with a single word, a single gesture? A man who seemed to want nothing in return. She turned her horse towards the trail. She owed him that much. The ranch was a small, unassuming place, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled against the foothills. Smoke curled from the chimney of a small cabin, a sign of life in the desolate landscape. Martha dismounted, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the rough-hewn wood. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open, revealing Jericho standing in the doorway, his face etched with surprise. He was shirtless, his chest scarred and weathered, a testament to a life lived hard. He held a rag in his hand stained with blood. His eyes widened as he saw Martha and the children. What are you doing here?" Martha swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. I came to thank you." Jericho frowned, his gaze shifting past her to the children. "There's no need." "Yes, there is," Martha insisted, stepping forward. "You saved us. You gave us a chance." Jericho stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished, but clean. A cot lay in the corner, and on it, a figure lay still, covered in a blanket. "I wasn't expecting company," Jericho said, his voice tight. Martha's eyes were drawn to the cot. "Who is that?" Jericho hesitated, his jaw clenching. A friend." She moved closer, her curiosity piqued. She gently pulled back the blanket, revealing the face of a man, pale and gaunt, his eyes closed. It was Caleb. Martha gasped, stumbling backward. "Caleb? But he's dead." Jericho grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "He's not dead, not yet." He led her away from the cot, his voice low and urgent. "He was sick, yes, but he wasn't dead. I found him. After the fever took him, he was left for dead. I brought him here." "But why?" Martha asked, her mind reeling. Jericho looked away, his face etched with pain. "Because," Jericho said, his voice barely a whisper, "I owed him." He wouldn't elaborate. The words caught in his throat like a dry cough. Martha didn't push. She saw the pain in his eyes, a deep-seated grief that mirrored her own. The unspoken hung heavy in the air, thicker than the dust kicked up by a passing stagecoach. Caleb was alive, clinging to life, but alive. The revelation shattered her carefully constructed reality, leaving her adrift in a sea of confusion and conflicting emotions. Relief warred with anger, gratitude with resentment. Why hadn't he told her? Why let her believe he was gone? "He was ashamed," Jericho finally said, as if reading her thoughts. "Ashamed of the debt, ashamed of the life he was leading. He didn't want you to see him like that." Martha sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. The triplets, sensing her distress, huddled around her, their small hands clutching her skirts. What happens now?" "That's up to you," Jericho said, his gaze steady. "He needs care. He's weak, but he's fighting." The decision was hers, a choice between the new life she had envisioned, A life free from Caleb's gambling and recklessness. And the old life. The life she had shared with him. The life that had been ripped away so brutally. She looked at her children, their faces mirroring Caleb's, their futures inextricably linked to his. She looked at Jericho, the silent benefactor, the man who had given them all a second chance. "I'll stay," she said, her voice firm. "I'll help him." Jericho nodded, a flicker of something akin to relief crossing his face. "I'll need to go to Redemption for supplies. I've been tending to him myself, but—" He trailed off, gesturing towards the children. "I understand," Martha said. "We can manage here." Jericho hesitated. "Redemption isn't friendly, especially to strangers." "We'll be fine," Martha insisted. "We've faced worse." Jericho saddled his horse, his movements economical and precise. He glanced at Martha, a sealant question in his eyes. She met his gaze, offering a small, grateful smile. He rode off towards Redemption, a lone figure against the vast horizon. The town, a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled around a dusty main street, lived up to its name only in irony. The air hung thick with suspicion and unspoken grievance. As Jericho dismounted in front of the general store, eyes followed him. He was an outsider, and Redemption didn't take kindly to outsiders. Sheriff Thompson, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard living and weary justice, watched him from the porch of the saloon. He recognized the type, a man who kept to himself, a man with a past. Inside the store, Jericho purchased medicine, bandages, and broth. The storekeeper, a gaunt man with a perpetual sneer, eyed him with open hostility. "Something wrong out at your place, stranger?" Jericho ignored him, paying for his goods and turning to leave. As he did, he noticed a young woman tending to her mother, who lay pale and weak, on a makeshift bed, in the corner of the store. Sarah, her name was. She was young, barely more than a girl, but her eyes held a world of worry. He bought an extra bottle of tonic, a potent elixir rumored to cure all ills, and placed it on the counter near Sarah. "For your mother," he said, his voice low. Sarah looked up, startled. Her eyes, the color of rainwater, met his. She noticed his hands, calloused but clean. The hands of a man who worked hard but wasn't afraid of getting them dirty. They weren't the hands of a common laborer, but something else, something more. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jericho nodded and left the store, the weight of Redemption's suspicion pressing down on him. He knew he wouldn't be welcome here for like, but he had what he needed. Now he just had to get back to Martha and Caleb, and back to the quiet solitude of the ranch, back to the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in the barren landscape of their lives. Jericho's hand tightened on the reins as he left the general store, the weight of Redemption's scrutiny heavy on his shoulders. He'd lingered too long. The tonic for Sarah's mother, a spur-of-the-moment act of kindness, had drawn unwanted attention. As he stepped onto the dusty street, Sarah rushed out of the store, her face etched with desperation. She clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help her." Jericho frowned, trying to disengage. "I'm no doctor, I heard them talking," Sarah interrupted, her eyes wide with fear. "They say you're the outlaw doctor, that you know things, that you can heal what others can't." Sheriff Thompson, leaning against the porch post, straightened up, his gaze sharpening. He'd heard whispers, rumors that swirled around Jericho like dust devils, tales of a man with uncanny medical knowledge. A man who'd disappeared from polite society years ago. A man who preferred the company of coyotes to people. Jericho's jaw tightened. The label, Outlaw Doctor, was a brand he'd tried to outrun, a ghost he couldn't shake. He glanced at Thompson. The lawman's eyes narrowed, calculating. Helping Sarah's mother would mean exposing himself, risking unwanted questions, dredging up a past he'd buried deep. He looked back at Sarah, her face pale and pleading. He saw the raw desperation in her eyes, the same desperation he'd seen in Martha's. He saw the reflection of his own buried conscience. "She's fading fast," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "The town doctor says there's nothing he can do. Please, just look at her, please." The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the saloon door and the distant caw of a crow. Jericho knew he was caught between a rock and a hard place. Thompson was watching, waiting. Turning Sarah away would solidify his image as a cold-hearted outsider, a man who cared for no one. Helping her would invite scrutiny, potentially jeopardizing Martha and Caleb. He took a deep breath, the desert air stinging his lungs. He made his choice. "Take me to her," he said, his voice low and resolute. Sarah's face lit up with a fragile hope. She led him back into the store, past the sneering storekeeper, past the curious onlookers, to the corner where her mother lay. Thompson watched them go, his eyes never leaving Jericho's back. The outlaw doctor was about to play his hand, and redemption was about to see what he was holding. The game had just begun. The air in the corner of the general store was thick with the smell of dust and sickness. Sarah's mother, Ilara, lay pale and still, her breathing shallow and ragged. Jericho knelt beside her, his touch gentle as he examined her, his fingers probing, assessing. He listened to her chest, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jericho didn't answer immediately. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small pouch of herbs. He ground them with a mortar and pestle, mixing them with water from his canteen. "It's a lung infection," he finally said, his voice low. "She needs rest, warmth, and this." He offered Sarah the mixture. "Give her small sips every few hours." He then unwrapped the bandages he'd bought and began to clean Ilara's wound, a festering sore on her arm. He worked quickly and efficiently, his hands moving with a practiced grace that belied his rough exterior. As he stitched the wound closed, he muttered a term, approximating the dermal edges, minimizing tension. Sarah, who had spent countless hours tending to her mother, recognized the phrase. She'd seen it in an old medical book, a relic from her father, a man who had dreamed of being a doctor, but never had the chance. "Dermal edges?" she asked, her voice hesitant. That's from Dr. Beaumont's experiments and observations on gastric juice." Jericho's hand paused, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked by a practiced indifference. "The book's out of print," Sarah pressed, her suspicion growing. "How would you know that term?" He resumed his work, his jaw tight. "I read a lot," he said curtly. Sarah wasn't convinced. She watched him, her eyes scrutinizing his every move. She saw the precision in his stitches, the knowledge in his touch. He wasn't just a rancher, an outlaw. He was a doctor. Or at least he had been. As the hours passed, Ilara's breathing steadied, her color slowly returning. Jericho stayed by her side, monitoring her progress, offering words of encouragement to Sarah. "She's strong," he said, his voice softer now. "She'll pull through." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the store, Jericho finally stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "I need to get back," he said, his gaze distant. "I have responsibilities." Sarah walked him to the door, her eyes filled with gratitude and curiosity. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "You saved her life." "She saved herself," Jericho replied, his voice gruff. "I just gave her a little push." He hesitated, then turned back to Sarah, his eyes, usually guarded, filled with a fleeting vulnerability. "There was a time," he said, his voice low, "when I thought I could make a difference. When I thought I could heal the world. He paused, a shadow passing over his face. But some wounds never heal. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. She knew then that Jericho was more than just an outlaw doctor. He was a man haunted by his past, a man carrying a burden she couldn't begin to comprehend. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she wasn't done with him yet. The weight of redemption lifted slightly as Jericho rode away from the general store. But the reprieve was short-lived. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, mirroring the unease churning in his gut. He pushed his horse harder, eager to put distance between himself and the town, between himself and the memories. Sarah had stirred. He was halfway back to Martha's ranch when he saw him. A lone figure silhouetted against the fading light, astride a horse as black as midnight. There was something familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he sat in the saddle. As Jericho drew closer, the figure spurred his horse forward, closing the gap between them. The man's face was obscured by shadow, but Jericho recognized the voice, a gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down his spine. "Well, well, well," the man said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "If it isn't Alistair Finch. Come a long way from Boston, haven't you, Doc?" Jericho froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt peacemaker at his hip. The name, Alistair Finch, hadn't been spoken aloud in years. It was a name he'd buried, a life he'd left behind. Only one person knew that name, one person he thought he'd escaped. "Boone," Jericho said, his voice barely a whisper. Boone chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. He spurred his horse closer, the moonlight illuminating his face. A network of scars crisscrossed his left cheek, a permanent reminder of the night their lives had changed forever. "Surprised to see me, Alistair?" Boone asked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Thought you'd left me for dead, did you? Left me to rot in that hellhole?" He spat on the ground, the gesture dripping with venom. Jericho's jaw tightened. The memories flooded back, unwelcome and sharp. The botched surgery, the angry mob, the fire, and his own cowardice. He'd run, leaving Boone to face the consequences. "I thought you were dead," Jericho said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Dead?" Boone laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "No, Doc. I just spent a long time healing and plotting. And now here you are, playing the Good Samaritan in some backwater town. Healing the sick, are we? After what you did to me." He reached inside his coat, his hand emerging with a tarnished silver scalpel, the same type Jericho used to carry. "I think it's time you paid the price for your little indiscretion, Alistair." Boone hissed, his eyes fixed on Jericho with a predatory gleam. "It's time for a little surgery." Jericho stared at the scalpel, the moonlight glinting off its honed edge. The memories crashed over him. The sterile scent of the operating theater, the panicked screams, the searing pain. He'd tried to bury that life, to wash it away with the dust of the desert. But Boone was a specter risen from the grave, determined to drag him back into the abyss. "What do you want, Boone?" Jericho asked, his voice low and dangerous. He knew Boone wasn't just looking for revenge. There was something colder, more calculated in his eyes. Boone grinned, a chilling display of yellowed teeth. "Oh, I don't want your money, Alistair, though I'm sure you've accumulated a tidy sum out here in the sticks. No, I want something far more valuable." He paused, savoring the moment. "I want your life." Jericho's hand tightened on the reins. He knew Boone wasn't speaking literally. He wanted to destroy Jericho's reputation, to strip away the fragile peace he'd built for himself and Martha and Caleb. "There's a little bank in redemption," Boone continued, his voice a silken threat. "In the safe, nestled amongst the ledgers and gold, is a locked strongbox. Inside that box are a few trinkets you left behind when you so abruptly abandoned your career. And me, your original surgical kit, Alistair. And something far more damning, your medical license, the one that bears the name Dr. Alistair Finch. Jericho felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Those relics of his past were like a loaded gun pointed at his future. I know about your little family, Alistair. Boone purred, his gaze unwavering. Martha, is it? And the boy, Caleb. Seems you've finally found something worth protecting. Wouldn't want anything to happen to them, would you? The threat was clear, unspoken but heavy in the air. Boone knew exactly where to strike. Here's the deal, Doc, Boone said, leaning closer. Tonight, someone in redemption is going to die. A prominent citizen. Someone who displeased me. He chuckled. The sheriff won't look too hard for the culprit. Not if all the evidence points to one man. A man with medical training. A man with a motive. Jericho understood. Boone wanted him to be framed for murder. He wanted to use Jericho's past, his skills, against him, turning him into an irredeemable outlaw, a fugitive with no escape. You want me to plant evidence, Jericho said, his voice flat. Precisely, Boone replied, his eyes gleaming with triumph. A few strategically placed tools from your old kit. A little surgical alteration to the victim. Something to make it look like a professional job. Something that only Dr. Alistair Finch could have done. Jericho was trapped. If he refused, Boone would expose him, revealing his past to redemption, destroying his life with Martha and Caleb. He'd be branded an outlaw, a fraud. And worse, Boone would likely harm Martha and Caleb to ensure his silence. And if I don't cooperate? Jericho asked, already knowing the answer. Boone smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. Then I'll be forced to reveal your true identity to Sheriff Thompson. I'll tell him all about Dr. Finch and his unfortunate history. And of course, I'll have to pay a little visit to Martha and Caleb, just to ensure they understand the importance of a discretion. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the sagebrush. Jericho was caught in a vice, squeezed between his past and his present, between his desire for redemption and the safety of his family. He knew he had a choice to make, a choice that would determine the fate of everyone he cared about. And he knew, with a sinking heart, that he didn't have a choice at all. He was a pawn in Boone's twisted game, forced to play a hand he couldn't win. The desert wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed Jericho's internal turmoil. He stared at Boone, the scalpel glinting under the cold light of the moon, a physical manifestation of the choice he was forced to make. He could cooperate, become the monster Boone believed him to be, or risk everything he held dear. Each option tasted like poison. I need time, Jericho rasped, buying himself a few precious moments. Boone chuckled, a sound that grated on Jericho's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Time? You've had a lifetime, Alistair. The deed needs to be done tonight. The townsfolk are already asleep, dreaming their simple dreams. Don't you think it's time to shatter a few? Jericho's mind raced. He needed a way out, a way to protect Martha and Caleb without becoming Boone's instrument of death. He thought of Sarah, her unwavering gaze, her quiet strength. She saw something in him, something he thought long dead. A healer, a man capable of doing good. Could he betray that faith? Could he become the very thing he'd spent years running from? Who? Jericho asked, his voice flat, resigned. He needed to know the target, to understand the stakes. Boone grinned, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Judge Peabody, a righteous old fool who thinks he can stand in my way. He needs to learn that no one defies Boone. Judge Peabody. Jericho knew him. A stern but fair man, respected by the community. He'd even offered Jericho a kind word once, when he'd first arrived in redemption. To kill him, even indirectly, was unthinkable. "And what if I refuse?" Jericho asked, knowing it was a futile gesture. Boone shrugged, a casual indifference that belied the menace in his eyes. "Then Martha and Caleb will suffer the consequences, slowly, painfully. I'm quite adept at causing discomfort." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "And of course, Sheriff Thompson will be very interested to learn about Dr. Alistair Finch and his unfortunate past." Jericho felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He was trapped, a puppet dancing on Boone's strings. He looked at Boone, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction, and a flicker of something akin to pity crossed his mind. Boone was a broken man, consumed by bitterness and revenge. He was a walking corpse, fueled by hatred. "All right," Jericho said, the word heavy with defeat. "I'll do it." Boone's grin widened. "Good boy, Alistair. I knew I could count on you." He tossed Jericho a small leather-wrapped package. "Your tools, carefully preserved just for this occasion. And remember, Doc, any deviation from the plan, and your little family pays the price." Jericho took the package, the leather solid and slick in his hand. He stared at Boone, his eyes filled with a burning resolve. He might be forced to play Boone's game, but he wouldn't play it by Boone's rules. He would find a way to protect Martha and Caleb, to expose Boone for the monster he was, without sacrificing his own soul. He would use Boone's plan against him, turning the tables on his tormentor. The healer within him, the man Sarah believed him to be, wouldn't allow any other outcome. He would not kill, even to save those he loved. There had to be another way. Jericho stared at the leather-wrapped package in his hand, a physical weight representing the burden of Boone's demands. The desert wind seemed to whisper accusations, echoing the turmoil in his soul. He looked up at Boone, his face illuminated by the cold moonlight, a twisted reflection of the man he once knew. "I won't kill Judge Peabody," Jericho said, his voice firm, defying the tremor that threatened to betray his fear. Boone's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "You dare defy me, Alistair? After everything? You think you can just walk away from this?" "I'm not walking away," Jericho replied, his gaze unwavering. "I'm ending it. Right here, right now." Boone laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the desolate landscape. "Ending it? You think you're strong enough to end anything, Alistair? You're a coward, always have been. You ran then, and you're running now, hiding behind a new name, a new life." "I'm not running," Jericho said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm standing my ground." "Standing your ground?" Boone sneered. "You abandoned me, Alistair. Left me to rot in that hellhole after your mistake. You think I forgot? You think I forgave you?" The memories flooded back, sharp and painful. The operating theater, the panicked screams, the fire. He saw Boone lying on the floor, bleeding, his face contorted in agony. He remembered the mob, their faces twisted with rage, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. And he remembered running, leaving Boone to face the consequences. "It was an accident, Boone," Jericho said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Boone roared, his voice filled with venom. "A mistake that cost me everything. My career, my reputation, my legacy. You think a simple mistake makes up for that, Alistair?" He gestured to the scars that crisscrossed his left cheek. "This is your legacy, Doc. This is what you left me with." "I tried to help you," Jericho said, his voice pleading. "I did everything I could." "Everything you could?" Boone spat on the ground. "You ran. You left me to die. You're a coward, Alistair Finch, a gutless coward who cares only about saving his own skin." Jericho's jaw tightened. Boone's words struck a nerve, hitting the raw, festering wound of his past. He knew Boone was right in a way. He had been a coward. He had run. But he had changed. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth protecting. Maybe I was a coward then, Jericho said, his voice low but firm. But I'm not anymore. I won't let you hurt Martha. I won't let you hurt Caleb. And I won't let you force me to kill an innocent man. Boone's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening into a predatory stare. You think you can stop me, Alistair? You think your newfound courage can stand against my years of planning, my years of rage? He reached inside his coat, his hand emerging with the tarnished silver scalpel. This is my revenge, Alistair. And you, Judge Peabody, and everyone else who ever wronged me, will pay the price. Jericho knew he couldn't reason with Boone. He was too far gone, consumed by bitterness and hate. He had to stop him, not just for Martha and Caleb, but for the sake of redemption, for the sake of his own soul. He tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes fixed on Boone. The desert wind howled around them, a mournful cry that seemed to foreshadow the coming storm. The showdown had begun. Jericho saw the glint of steel, the moonlight catching on Boone's scalpel as he lunged. He spurred his horse forward, a desperate gamble to intercept Boone before he could act. But Boone was quicker, fueled by years of simmering rage. He slashed out, the blade aimed at Jericho's throat. Jericho ducked, the scalpel whistling past his ear. He felt a searing pain as it grazed his shoulder, tearing through his shirt. He ignored the pain, focusing on the immediate threat. He drew his own revolver, the cold steel a comfort in his hand. This doesn't have to end this way, Boone, Jericho said, his voice strained. Let it go. Let me help you. Boone laughed, a manic, hollow sound. Help me? You can't help me, Alistair. No one can. The only thing that can help me is seeing you suffer, seeing you pay for what you did. He lunged again, the scalpel flashing in the moonlight. Jericho fired, the shot echoing across the desert. Boone staggered back, clutching his arm, a crimson stain blooming on his sleeve. But he didn't miss. You missed, Doc, Boone snarled, his eyes burning with hatred. You always were a terrible shot. He raised the scalpel again, his face contorted in a mask of rage. Jericho braced himself for another attack, knowing he couldn't afford to miss again. Then a scream pierced the night. Sarah. Jericho's head snapped around. He saw her standing near the edge of the clearing, her face pale with terror. A stray bullet, fired in the chaos of the moment, had found its mark. She clutched her side, blood seeping between her fingers. Sarah, Jericho cried, his heart twisting with fear. Boone saw his opportunity. He grinned, a cruel, triumphant expression on his face. Looks like your little friend is in trouble, Doc. What are you going to do? Save her, or finish this? Jericho froze, torn between two impossible choices. He could tend to Sarah, try to stop the bleeding, but that would leave Boone free to escape, to continue his reign of terror. Or he could pursue Boone and the threat once and for all. But that would mean leaving Sarah to bleed, possibly to die. His mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to save both Sarah and stop Boone. But there was none. He had to choose. He looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with pain and fear. He saw the trust she placed in him, the belief she had in his ability to heal. He couldn't abandon her. He wouldn't. I'm coming, Sarah, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. He turned his back on Boone, holstering his revolver. He knew it was a gamble, a risk that could cost him everything. But he couldn't live with himself if he let Sarah die. He ran to her, dropping to his knees beside her. He gently pushed her hand away, examining the wound. It was bad. The bullet had pierced deep into her side. It's all right, Sarah, he said, his voice trembling. I'm here. I'm going to help you. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against the wound. He had to stop the bleeding, had to buy her time. He knew he needed to get her back to redemption, to a doctor, but he didn't know if she would make it. He looked up, his eyes filled with despair. Boone was gone. He had vanished into the darkness, leaving Jericho with the consequences of his choice. He had saved Sarah, but he had let Boone escape. And he knew with a sinking heart that the nightmare was far from over. The scalpel glimmered in the dirt where Boone had dropped it. It was a grim reminder of what Jericho had chosen and the price he might yet have to pay. Jericho worked quickly, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency honed over years, despite the tremor of fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He packed the wound with the makeshift bandage, applying firm pressure. Sarah whimpered, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Hold this tight," he instructed, his voice calm despite the turmoil within. "Don't let up the pressure. I need to get you back to town." He knew every second counted. The blood loss was significant, and the rough ride back to redemption could easily worsen her condition. But he couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for Boone to return. He had to act. He gently lifted Sarah into his arms, wincing at her gasp of pain. She was light, but the weight of his responsibility felt crushing. He carried her to his horse, carefully settling her in the saddle, supporting her weight as he led the animal forward. "Just hold on, Sarah," he murmured, his breath catching in his throat. "We're going home." As they moved slowly through the darkness, Jericho wrestled with the choices before him. Boone was still out there, a threat to redemption, a danger to Martha and Caleb. He had to stop him, but he couldn't leave Sarah. An idea, desperate and risky, began to form in his mind. He needed to draw Boone out, to create a situation where he could be dealt with, but without putting Sarah in further danger. He needed a diversion. Reaching the outskirts of redemption, Jericho found a small abandoned shack. He carefully laid Sarah down inside, making her as comfortable as possible with a tattered blanket he found in a corner. "I need to go," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I have to stop Boone, but I promise I'll be back as soon as I can. I'll get Doc Miller." Sarah nodded weakly, her eyes filled with trust. "Be careful, Jericho," she whispered. Jericho squeezed her hand, then turned and ran back towards town. He knew Boone's objective, the surgical kit locked away in the bank, the tools of Jericho's former life, the instruments of Boone's twisted revenge. He had to prevent Boone from getting his hands on them. He reached the bank just as the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. The town was still quiet, the residents unaware of the danger lurking in their midst. Jericho knew he had to act fast. He circled around to the back of the bank, finding a loose window he could pry open. He slipped inside, moving silently through the darkened building. He could hear Boone's muffled voice coming from the vault. Jericho crept closer, peering through the bars of the vault door. He saw Boone, his face a mask of fury, struggling with the lock. He was clearly frustrated, his earlier confidence replaced by a desperate urgency. "Now!" Jericho shouted, his voice echoing through the bank. "Boone, it's over. Get out of here." Boone whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise. He lunged at Jericho, brandishing a crowbar he had apparently been using on the lock. Jericho dodged the blow, narrowly avoiding a crushing impact. He grappled with Boone, struggling to disarm him. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged fight. Boone was stronger, fueled by siege. He just needed to buy enough time. Suddenly, the town marshal, alerted by the commotion, burst through the front door of the bank, gun drawn. "Freeze! Drop the weapon!" Boone, seeing his opportunity slipping away, shoved Jericho aside and grabbed the surgical kit from the vault. He bolted out the back door, disappearing into the maze of alleyways behind the bank. Jericho could have pursued him, could have tried to capture him, but his gaze fell upon the town's forge. Its furnace roared, ready to smelt the day's iron. He knew what he had to do. He ran after Boone, not to capture him, but to intercept him. Boone, seeing Jericho gaining ground, turned and fired a shot, narrowly missing him. "Get out of my way, Alistair," Boone yelled. Jericho didn't respond. He lunged forward, tackling Boone to the ground. The surgical kit flew from Boone's grasp, landing near the forge. Jericho scrambled to his feet, grabbing the kit. He ignored Boone's furious struggles, his desperate pleas. He ran towards the forge, the heat searing his skin. With a final desperate act, he hurled the surgical kit into the heart of the flames. The leather burst into fire, the metal instruments glowing red-hot, their purpose forever extinguished. The metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of burning leather from the forge. Jericho stood, chest heaving, watching the last embers of his past life consumed by the flames. Boone, subdued and bound, was being led away by the marshal, his face a twisted mask of defeat and simmering rage. The townsfolk murmured, their fear slowly giving way to a cautious relief. Jericho barely registered their presence. His thoughts were solely on Sarah, back in the abandoned shack, waiting. He turned to leave, but a hand on his arm stopped him. It was Martha, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something akin to understanding. "Jericho," she said softly, "thank you for everything." He simply nodded, unable to find the words to express the turmoil within him. He knew he couldn't stay, not now, not with the truth about him hanging in the air like gunsmoke. He needed to see Sarah, to ensure she was all right. And then, he didn't know. Perhaps he needed to disappear again, to protect them all from the shadow of his past. He found Sarah weaker, but conscious. Doc Miller, summoned from his bed, was tending to her wound. He grunted a greeting, his face grim. "She's lost a lot of blood," Doc Miller rasped, his voice rough with sleep. "Needs rest and plenty of it. Lucky you got to her when you did." Jericho knelt beside Sarah, his gaze searching her face. "How are you feeling?" She managed a weak smile. "Sore, but alive, thanks to you." She coughed, a small fleck of blood appearing on her lips. Doc Miller moved to wipe it away, but Sarah stopped him, her gaze fixed on Jericho. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his rough, calloused hand. "Jericho," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No drifter knows how to tie a surgeon's knot like that." The air hung thick with unspoken words. Jericho froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been so careful, so diligent in burying his past. How could she know? He braced himself for accusations, for fear, for the inevitable rejection. But it didn't come. Instead, Sarah's eyes were filled with a gentle understanding, a quiet acceptance that disarmed him more than any accusation could have. "I saw," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, "the way you moved, the knowledge in your hands. I suspected something, but what I saw was a good man, trying to atone." She wasn't speaking from rumor, from the whispers that must have followed him since he arrived in redemption. She was speaking from observation, from the quiet moments she had witnessed, from the way he had treated Caleb, from the unwavering determination in his eyes. She had seen past the drifter, past the assumed identity, and recognized the man beneath. A wave of emotion washed over Jericho, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and a profound sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. He had expected judgment, condemnation. Instead, he found forgiveness, understanding, and a glimmer of hope he thought he had long lost. He squeezed her hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Better? She cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "What matters is who you are now." And in that moment, Jericho knew he couldn't run. He couldn't hide. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth protecting. And maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he could finally find redemption. He looked at Sarah, her eyes shining with a quiet strength, and knew his journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't facing it alone. Jericho looked into Sarah's eyes, searching for any hint of fear or doubt. He found only warmth, a steadfast belief that resonated deep within his soul. It was a forgiveness he hadn't dared hope for, a balm to the years of self-reproach that had haunted his every step. He took a shaky breath, the weight on his chest easing ever so slightly. He hadn't been lying when he said he was a drifter. He had been running, hiding from the shadows of Alistair Finch, the surgeon who'd made a terrible mistake. But Sarah's words, her unwavering gaze, chipped away at the hardened shell he had built around himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally lay that ghost to rest. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Thompson stepped inside, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored Jericho's own. He'd witnessed the events at the bank, the confrontation with Boone, the desperate act of destroying the surgical kit. He'd seen Jericho choose the safety of redemption over the pursuit of vengeance. The sheriff nodded curtly to Doc Miller, then fixed his gaze on Jericho. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by Sarah's shallow breaths. Jericho steeled himself, expecting arrest, extradition, a return to the life he'd so desperately tried to escape. Instead, Thompson walked to the rough-hewn table beside Sarah's bed and placed a folded piece of paper upon it. It was old, yellowed, the ink faded with time. Jericho recognized it instantly. A wanted poster, bearing a sketch of his younger self, Alistair Finch, wanted for, well, the charges were numerous and damning. Jericho's heart hammered against his ribs. The past had finally caught up with him. He closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But it didn't come. The sheriff struck a match, the flame flickering in the dim light. He held it to the corner of the poster, and the paper ignited, curling and blackening as the fire consumed it. Jericho stared, dumbfounded, as the flames danced and devoured the last vestiges of his former life. He watched as the past, the guilt, the fear, turned to ash before his very eyes. When the last flicker of flame died, Thompson looked at Jericho, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I saw what you did, Jericho," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I saw you throw that kid into the fire. I saw you protect this town, protect her." He gestured towards Sarah. "This town needs a doctor more than it needs a ghost. Consider that debt paid." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And Alistair Finch is dead as far as I'm concerned." The sheriff turned and walked out, leaving Jericho speechless, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Jericho looked at the ashes on the table, then back at Sarah, then out the window, at the rising sun painting the sky. With hues of gold and crimson, a new day was dawning, not just for the town of redemption, but for him as well. He still had a long way to go, a lot to atone for. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could find peace, find purpose, find redemption. Not in running from his pasties, but in facing it, and in using his skills to heal, to protect, to serve. He had been given a second chance, a chance to truly live. He wouldn't waste it. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of healing. Jericho, no longer a drifter, but not yet fully Alistair Finch the surgeon, found himself somewhere in between, a man defined by his actions rather than his past. The townsfolk, initially wary, began to seek him out, not just for bullet wounds and broken bones, but for aches that ran deeper, for sorrows that medicine alone couldn't cure. He tended to them all, drawing on a well of empathy he hadn't realized he possessed. He set up a makeshift clinic in the back of the general store, its shelves now stocked with more than just dry goods and hardware. Martha, surprisingly, became his most reliable assistant, her quick mind and steady hands proving invaluable. She learned quickly, absorbing his knowledge with an eagerness that both humbled and encouraged him. He even started teaching Caleb basic first aid, seeing in the boy a spark of compassion that reminded him of his younger self. Before the war, before the darkness consumed him, Sheriff Thompson, true to his word, never spoke of Alastair Finch again. Instead, he treated Jericho with a quiet respect, a silent acknowledgement of the debt he believed was owed. Their interactions were sparse, mostly curt nods and shared glances. But beneath the surface simmered a mutual understanding, a shared commitment to the safety and well-being of redemption. The sheriff, a man of few words, relied on Jericho's judgment, often seeking his counsel on matters that went beyond the strictly medical. The forge, now silent except for the daily work, became an unspoken symbol of Jericho's absolution. One sweltering afternoon, a wagon pulled into town, its occupants a family ravaged by illness. The father, gaunt and weak, coughed incessantly, his wife and children clinging to him, their faces etched with fear. They had been traveling for ease, searching for a doctor, any doctor, willing to treat them. Most had turned them away, fearing Cowboy. Jericho, without hesitation, took them in. He examined the father, his brow furrowed with concern. It was a severe case of pneumonia, exacerbated by exhaustion and malnutrition. He knew the chances of survival were slim, but he wouldn't give up. He worked tirelessly day and night, administering what little medicine he had, nursing the family back to health with a combination of skill, compassion, and unwearying determination. Martha helped, cleaning and bandaging, preparing nourishing broths, offering words of comfort. Even Caleb pitched in, fetching water, running errands, his youthful energy a source of inspiration to the weary family. Slowly, painstakingly, the family began to recover. The father's cough subsided, his strength returned. The children's faces regained their color. They were deeply grateful, their eyes filled with a warmth that melted Jericho's heart. As they prepared to leave, the father approached Jericho, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved our lives, Doctor," he said, his hand outstretched. "We'll never forget your kindness." Jericho shook his hand, his own grip firm and steady. "Just pay it forward," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Help someone else in need." As the wagon pulled away, Jericho watched them go, a sense of profound satisfaction washing over him. He had done more than just heal their bodies. He had restored their hope, their faith in humanity. He had used his skills not to inflict pain, but to alleviate suffering, to make a difference in the lives of others. He was no longer running from his past. He was building a future, one act of kindness, one healing touch at a time. The shadow of Alastair Finch still lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness he had overcome. But it no longer defined him. He was Jericho now, the healer of redemption, a man who had found redemption in the most unexpected of places. The West was still wild, unforgiving, but in redemption there was a flicker of light, a testament to the power of second chances, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The dust swirled around the departing wagon, a gritty farewell to the family Jericho had nursed back to health. He watched them until they were swallowed by the vast expanse of the prairie, then turned back towards the clinic, a small smile playing on his lips. The setting sun cast long shadows across redemption, painting the wooden buildings in hues of orange and gold. The air was cooler now, a welcome respite from the day's oppressive heat. He found Sarah tending to her garden, a small patch of green amidst the parched landscape. She knelt beside a row of young tomato plants, carefully watering them with a tin can. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where she found solace and renewal after the hardships she had endured. It was a testament to her resilience, a symbol of the new life she was building for herself and Caleb. Jericho watched her for a moment, admiring her strength and her unwavering spirit. He had seen her blossom in recent weeks, her face regaining its color, her eyes shining with a newfound hope. He knew the scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined her. She was a survivor, a woman who had found the courage to rebuild her life, to create a future for herself and her son. He walked over to the garden and knelt beside her, the scent of damp earth filling his nostrils. "They'll be all right," he said, his voice soft. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks to you," she replied. "You've given them a second chance." Jericho shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "They did the work," he said. "I just helped them along the way." Sarah smiled, knowing he would never take credit for his good deeds. "You've helped a lot of people, Jericho," she said. "This town owes you a debt it can never repay." "I don't want any debt," Jericho replied. "I just want to make a difference." He looked out at the setting sun, its fiery glow illuminating the vast expanse of the west. It was a wild and unforgiving land, a place of hardship and struggle. But it was also a place of opportunity, a place where a man could find forgiveness and purpose, a place where a woman could rebuild her life and find happiness again. He glanced back at Sarah, her hands gently tending to the tomato plants. In her garden, in the small town of Redemption, he had found something he had never thought possible: a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. The West was still wild, but it was also a place where kindness could bloom, where healing could take root, where a man could find redemption, one act of compassion at a time. The image of the burning wanted poster flickered in his mind, a stark reminder of the past he had left behind. He looked at Sarah once more, her face etched with peace and contentment, and knew he had finally found his place. He was home.